These villages are sometimes surrounded by a wall, and sometimes by a stockade of plaited bamboos, but most of them have no sort of protection. On market days, which are held generally once in 6 days, the marketplace are crowded by the men and women of different tribes, which, by reason of the varied and picturesque costumes of the women, present an animated and interesting spectacle. These markets or fairs are mostly held in the towns and villages, but some of them are held in out-of-the-way places where no houses are to be seen. Here the people sell their livestock and farm produce, and buy such necessaries as they cannot produce or make for themselves. At some of the markets we have visited, the tribes people outnumber the Chinese by 10 to 1, but in some places it is the other way about. We have been in that hamlet, and if we had not been told they were Keh Lao, should certainly have thought they were Miao. The Keh Lao, like all the inhabitants of Guizhou, Chinese and non-Chinese, are great believers in demons and are very superstitious, but thus far we have had no opportunity of learning more of their religious notions. They are also known under the following names: Hua Keh Lao, from the various colors in the dress of the women; Yuya Keh Lao, from the custom of breaking a front tooth of a bride before she goes to her husband's home. The various dialects spoken by the Miao tribes differ considerably, so much so that a He Miao from the southeast cannot understand anything of the dialect spoken by a He Miao of the west. Of these two most dissimilar dialects are compared, it is easily seen that they are both variations of a common speech. Naturally, these variations are most marked in cases where the tribes are most widely separated geographically. But the differences of dialect in tribes which are only 30 or 40 miles apart are sometimes very great. In some of these cases it is very often the commonest words which show the greatest changes, for instance the pronouns, the negatives, and such common words as the verbs to be and to have. This striking difference of speech among people who must at one time have spoken the same language suggests that they have not only been separated geographically, but have also been apart for long periods of time. The Ho Miao call themselves Mpeo or Dempio. Da is merely a personal prefix. This word or sound Mp-O also means Enabai Kaidari. The He Miao women and the women of most of the other Miao tribes wear a good deal of embroidery in their costume. The amount of embroidery on the clothing of a He Miao young woman is astonishing. It takes them years to do the embroidery on the jacket and skirt in which they hope to be married, and one of the commonest sights in a He Miao village is a group of young girls sitting round the door of one of the houses, laughing and chatting and doing their embroidery. When the costumes are finished, they are worn on gala days before they are married and on festive occasions 4 years afterwards. I have asked my teacher and others if they call themselves Mpeo because of the embroidery their women wear, but none of them were able to say why they call themselves by that name. The Yachio Miao of Tatung, who live about 100 miles distant from the nearest He Miao, call themselves MPU, which is the same word and means embroidery * also with them. They also were not able to tell me why they are so named. The Hua Miao call themselves Hmong and Hmong Ai. The Shuishi Miao and Pe Miao also call themselves Hmong, and some of the other Miao call themselves Mao. Now all these words MPIL, MPEO, Mao, Hmong are doubtless the same word, but whether Mao and Hmong also mean embroidery or not in those dialects we are not at present able to say. Book of History. The He Miao, we have every reason to think, were the last to move into Guizhou. Some of them are to be found in Hunan, which is between Jiangxi and Guizhou, and we believe traces of their language are to be found in some of the local dialects of Jiangxi. The Hua Miao say they have always lived where, or very near to where, they are now. However, when the Keh Lao are mentioned, they readily admit that the Keh Lao were in the district before them. Probably the Hua Miao were the first of the Miao tribes to move into those regions. It may be 2,000 or more years ago. The Chio Miao say their old home was in Tongking, and that they came to Guizhou by way of Sichuan and Yunnan. This is absurd, and we only put it on record because they insisted that it was so. They also say that when they die their souls return to their ancestors in Tongking. There can be no doubt these various tribes originally came from farther east. Though at vastly different periods, some of them 2,000 years ago, and the Hemiao last of all within the last 500 years. It may be, however, and is indeed very probable, that some of them moved about in different directions before they settled down. Miao are ruled much in the same way as the Chinese who have in villages and hamlets. The Miao are, we have many reasons to think, more litigious than the Chinese, constantly going to have the law on someone, or someone going to have the law on them. In many cases the affair is brought before the local headman, but on these occasions it is difficult to satisfy both parties, and the Lozeris almost certain to carry the case before the district magistrate. It is amazing to note how much of their time and money these people spend in legal proceedings, and very often fail to get justice after all. But it is a point oftener with them, and they think it due to themselves and their reputations to fight a casito the bitter end. This love of litigation is encouraged by secretaries and underhangs in the various yamen, who depend for their having principal lion the law cases, civil and criminal, brought before the magistrate. If there were no litigation these men would starve. Thus cases that have been settled, and possibly justly settled by the headman, can always be reopened before the district magistrate, and cases settled by own magistrate can be retried by his successor. This is not from any love of justice, but for the sake of the bribes, squeezes, and fees that arito be obtained from the litigants. The average incumbency of a district magistrate in Guizhou is not, we think, over 12 months. Not only do the yamen people profit by the cases brought before the magistrate, but very often underhangs, and others in league with the yamen, foment litigation and exhort the simple country folk to take their grievances or reopen their cases before the magistrate. The longer a case lasts, and the more people can be drawn into it, the more profit there is for the yamen. Very often cases are trumped up and false accusations made, and even if the accused finally obtains a verdict in his favor, it will only be after he has been mercilessly squeezed by these harpies. Probably on account of their ignorance and the lack of men among them with literary degrees, which would give them the privilege of interviewing the magistrate, the Miao are even more squeezed than the Chinese. Yamen secretaries, however, are neither partial nor particular, but always Yuing and Zalusto extort money from everybody they can lay their hands on. Among the Miao nearly all the disputes arise on account of their land or their women. They recognize the marriage relation, but do not observe it as strictly as the Chinese. Miao women have more liberty and are more unconventional than Chinese women, and consequently many of their marriages are the result of mutual euching. Not infrequently, however, a girl is practically sold for money to a husband chosen by the parents, and in these cases the result is often disastrous. The young woman will probably run away from her husband's home and continue to meet her lover. If pressure is brought to bear upon her from her parents or parents-in-law, as it generally is, she may return to her husband's home, make herself thoroughly disagreeable, and run away again in a short time. After this has happened repeatedly, the husband in despair tries all Hudson to find out who is the lover. When he finds this out, He sends an invitation to the lover and to his wife's people to come before the elders of the district and talk over his grievance. Sometimes these discussions last for days. The husband pretends to want his wife back. But as a matter of fact, he has had quite enough of her and really desires to have the money he paid for her returned to him. The wife's father pretends to be very angry, says his daughter was not well treated, that notwithstanding the hard work she had to do and the little food she got, she is willing to return, but her husband has never come to his home to fetch her. Note, it is the custom for a husband to make a present to his wife's fat heron such an occasion. Many angry words are spoken by the three parties concerned, and after everybody has added his or her word to the discussion, the case may be ended by the elders suggesting that the lover should repay the husband the cost of his wife and marry her himself, and that the husband should take the money and go elsewhere for a wife. If, however, the lover's influence is strong, the elders may decide that the girl go back to her husband, knowing that she will do nothing of the sort, or will not stay with him if she does go back. The case is thus only postponed for another time. We have assisted at some of the discussions of these matrimonial cases and know how hard they are to settle. These daughter-in-law cases are not often brought before the Chinese magistrate, except when they have led to fighting and, as sometimes happens, to serious wounds and homicide. In the west and northwest of the province, when the Miao are the tenants of the Ike Island holders, all disputes about the land are settled by the landlord, and their matrimonial disputes are settled among themselves, so there is very little litigation among them in the Chinese courts. To help the reader to understand the conditions under which the people of Guizhou, Chinese and non-Chinese, live outside the cities and towns, it should be mentioned that in most parts of the province there are local bands of robbers, dacoits they would be called in Burma, who prey upon travelers and upon the people who live in hidden villages and hamlets. As the population varies all over the province, some of these bands are composed of Chinese, some of Miao, and some of Chinese and Miao. 2 or 3 years ago when we were at Panghai, 2 days southwest of Shenyang, the Panghai robbers, while prowling not far from Pingsai, 15 miles lower down the river, kidnapped a Miao girl who was sister, or something else, to one of the Pingsai bandoff robbers. The Pingsai robbers resented this and threatened to come to Panghai and attack the Panghai band. Thereupon there was a great sharpening of swords and spears in Panghai marketplace and much tall talk. The Pingsai men, however, did not come, and one never heard how the affair was settled. Drink is, we believe, in most cases the cause of their poverty and degradation. The love of whiskey, which they make for themselves, is a prevailing vice among them all, men and women. Festivals, marriages, funerals, and sacrificial observances in reference to the dead are all occasions for the reckless consumption of whiskey. Chinese women at feasts sometimes drink more whiskey than is good for them, but they have the good sense even then to stay indoors till the effects of it have passed away. We cannot remember that we ever saw an intoxicated Chinese woman. But Miao women glory in their shame, and are not infrequently seen hilariously, helplessly drunk, parading or trying to parade along the village street. Some of these drinking bouts, on the occasion of a marriage or funeral, go on for 3 days and nights, and the sounds of drunken songs and revelry are heard all over the village. Morally most of them are below, and some of them immeasurably below, the Chinese. We know most about the He Miao and the Hua Miao, and these probably are the two extremes, the He Miao the best, and the Hua Miao and Ta Hua Miao of the west and northwest the worst, of all the Miao tribes. The vice of opium smoking is not so prevalent among them as it is among the Chinese, but many of them grow, and some of them smoke opium. During our own experience among them for 15 years, we have noticed the habit becoming more and more prevalent. In villages where 15 years ago only one ortwo smoked surreptitiously, there are now houses where many of them go and smoke openly. In the elevated regions of the West, where opium cannot be grown, the habit is almost unknown, but elsewhere it is spreading among them. Opium may not be a specific for all the ills that flesh is heir to, but it seldom fails to ease pain and give temporary relief. And among people who have no medical science, with opium always at hand, it is easy to foresee what the state of matters will be in the course of time if things go on as they are. Fortunately, the Chinese government seem determined to put an end to the cultivation of the poppy, and if they do put a stop to it, as we believe they will sooner or later, there will be an end to this vice among the Miao. Most of them are too poor to buy it for themselves, so cannot use it if they do not produce it. The Miao language, like the Chinese, is syllabic, unencumbered with conjugations or other inflections, and it would be very easy to present Miao words by Chinese characters which are not phonetic but ideographic. At the present time there are schools in the Maya villages where Chinese literature is taught. Probably from earliest times there have been some Miao, as there are now, who could read and write Chinese, and yet not one of them, as far as we know, ever attempted to put down their own words in writing. If such an attempt was ever made, it evidently met with no acceptance among the tribesmen, who remained to die as illiterate as their ancestors in the days of Yao and Xuan. When we opened a school at Panghai some years ago, and offered to teach the scholars to write their own language in the Roman script, the parents would not consent, but wished their children to learn to read and write Chinese. Their way of looking at the matter is not hard to understand. What writing they have to do must be done for them in Chinese. Any Miaoho can read and write. Passably may easily make his having among his neighbors by doing their reading and writing for them. All proclamations and official notifications, all pleas and counter-pleas in law cases have to be written in Chinese. When a Miao headman receives a dispatch from the magistrate, he has to find someone to read it for him and write his reply. All their contracts, mortgages, and deeds of sale or rental are written in Chinese, and not one in 100 of them. When he buys a piece of land is able to read the deed of sale when it is written. A man once explained to me how it happens that they have no written language. He said that many years ago the Miao were living in the neighborhood of the Chinese, and the Chinese were too crafty for them, so they determined to move westward and live by themselves. At that time they knew a few characters, but evidently knew very little else. After traveling for many days they came to a vast sheet of water, and, having no boats, were unable to proceed. As some of them stood perplexed at the edge of the water, they noticed some water spiders moving about on the surface of it, and they said one to another, "If these little things can walk on the water, why cannot we?" Thereupon they tried to walk on the surface of the water, which nearly cost them their lives. Before they managed to get back again on the bank, they swallowed a great deal of water, and with the water they swallowed all the characters they knew, and have been without characters ever since. This may be regarded as an historical romance with a basis of fact. They did move west away from the Chinese, and the sheet of water was doubtless the Tungting Lake. But are we to gather from it that there was a time when they had some characters, but have since forgotten them? If the Miao have no literature, they have plenty of legends handed down from earlier times. Who composed these legends no one knows, they are taught by the older Piaplito, the girls and boys. Many of them are in verse, 5 syllables to a line, the stanzas being of unequal length. One stanza interrogative and one responsive. These are sung or recited at their festivals by two persons or two groups, generally one group of young men and one group of young women, one group interrogating and the other responding. Among these legends, which I have written down from the one dictation of my He Miao teacher, is a story of the creation and a story of the flood. The story of creation commences. Who made heaven and earth? Who made insects? Who made men? Made male and made female? I who speak don't know. Vang Vai, heavenly king, made heaven and earth. Xiani made insects. Xiani made men and demons, made male and made female. How is it you don't know how made heaven and earth? How made insects? How made men and demons? Made male and made female? I who speak don't know. Heavenly king is, or was, intelligent. Spat a lot of spittle into his hand, clapped his hands with a noise, produced heaven and earth. Tall wild grass made insects. Stones made men and demons. Made male and made female. How is it you don't know? Made heaven in what way? Made earth in what way? Thus by rote I sing, but don't understand. Made heaven like a sun hat. Made earth like a dustpan. Why don't you understand? Made heaven a single lump, made earth a single lump. Who put heaven up? Heaven then so very high. Who separated earth low down? Earth then deep and low. I sing and don't understand. The poem then goes on to relate how heaven and earth were kept apart after they were separated. They tried all sorts of wood and all sorts of metal, and at length decided to prop up heaven with pillars made of silver. But where were they to get fire to melt the silver? Fire had gone up to heaven, how were they to bring it down? Fire eventually came down from heaven in a stone, and with raw steel and tinder they extracted the fire from the stone. After heaven had been propped up with silver pillars, the sun and moon and Milky Way were fixed in their places. The sun, however, went away and would not come back. Thereupon they sent various beasts and birds to call the sun to return, but they would not go, or if they went, the sun refused to come at their call. Finally, they sent the cock to call the sun to return, and when the cock crew the sun came back. The poem concludes that the proof of this is that when the cock crows the sun rises. Heavenly King is a translation of Vang Vai, the two words used as the name of the creator. In this legend it is very interesting to note how clearly and simply they say, Heavenly King made heaven and earth *. This is so different to the elaborate and confused cosmogony of the Chinese as to compel the opinion that we have here a very old tradition. Fo means thunder, but as we have just mentioned above, we do not know what Zai means. These two fell out about the division of the family possessions, a very common source of ill feeling among the Miao and others. Thunder evidently lived above, probably in heaven, and Azai lived on earth. When thunder threatened to destroy the earth with a deluge, Azai hollowed out a large gourd for himself, and collected 100 kinds and 1,000 sorts of seeds, and put them in a smaller gourd. After the flood, when the earth dragon had swallowed up all the water, and the hill dragon all the mist, the earth was again habitable. As all the people on the earth had been destroyed, and they were the only persons surviving, Azai asked his sister to be his wife. How this sister had been preserved is not clear in the He Miao version. She declined to be his wife on the ground that such a marriage was not proper. When Azai insisted, his sister proposed that each of them should take a millstone, and going to the top of adjacent hills should roll them down into the valley below. If these should be found together in the valley, one over the other after the manner of millstones, she would consent to marry him, but if they were found apart she would not be his wife. Now this Azai was a very crafty fellow. And thinking how very improbable it was that two stones rolled from adjacent hills should thus come together, he secretly procured two other millstones and put them one upon the other in the valley. The millstones that the brother and sister rolled from the hilltops were lost in the brushwood, but when they came down into the valley, Azai showed his sister the two stones he had placed in the position required and claimed that she should be his wife. She, however, was not yet satisfied and demanded another appeal to chance or overruling providence. She suggested that a scabbard for two knives should be placed in the valley, and each of them taking a knife should hurl them from the adjacent hilltops into the valley. If both knives were found in the scabbard, she would be his wife; if otherwise, she would not. Azai, again thinking it very improbable that the knives would be thrown into the scabbard from such a great distance, surreptitiously put two other knives in the scabbard. The knives thrown from the hilltops were, as he expected, lost, but when they came down into the valley, he showed her the two knives in the scabbard, and she finally consented to be his wife. In course of time a child was born to them without any limbs. Azai was very angry, and taking a big knife killed the child, chopped it to bits, and scattered the bits all over the hillside. Next morning they discovered that these pieces had all changed into men and women, and thus the earth was repeopled. Part of this legend may, as an illustration of all, be given in a rough translation of the metric version. Mr. H. J. Hewitt had the same story told him, in a different way, by the Hua Miao. Years ago they told me their story, but I did not write it down, so here is Mr. Hewitt's version. According to this, two brothers ploughed a field one day, and next morning found the soil all replaced and smoothed over as if it had never been disturbed. This happened 4 times, and being greatly perplexed they decided to plough the field over once more and observe what happened. In the middle of the night, while the brothers were watching, one on one side of the field and the other on the other side, they saw an old woman descend from heaven with a board in her hand, who, after replacing the clods of earth, smoothed them with the board. The elder brother at once shouted to the younger one to come and help him to kill the old woman who had undone all their work. But the younger brother suggested that they should first ask her why she did this and put them to so much trouble. So they asked the old woman why she had acted so, and made them labor in vain. She then told them it was useless for them to waste time in plowing land, as a great flood was coming to drown the world. She then advised the younger brother, because he had been kind to her and prevented the elder brother killing her, to save himself in a huge wooden drum. He was to cut down a tree, hollow it out from the bottom upwards, and nail a piece of skin over the opening. She told the elder brother, because he had wished to kill her, to make for himself an iron drum. They were each to retire into their respective drums when the flood came. When the flood came and the waters rose, the younger brother invited his sister to take refuge in his drum. And she did so. The elder brother was drowned in his iron drum, but the younger brother and his sister were safely preserved in the wooden one. The waters rose halfway up to heaven, and so high were the brother and sister carried in the hollow tree. With the rush of water they were carried hither and thither, and the tree at length was seen by one of the genii of heaven, who thought it was some huge creature with as many horns as the tree had branches. He was very much alarmed, and said, "I have only 12 horns, but this thing has many more. Whatever shall I do?" Thereupon he cried out for the dragon, lizards, tadpoles, and eels to clear out the channels and make holes for the waters of the flood to recede, and thus deliver him from the monster with so many horns. Through the efforts of the dragon and his crew, after 20 days the waters subsided, and the hollow tree stuck halfway down a steep and dangerous precipice. Then it came to pass that an eagle built its nest and hatched 2 young ones. This suggested a mode of deliverance from their difficult situation to the young man. He plucked some hair from his head, plaited a small cord, and with this tied the wings of the young eagles so that when they were fledged they were unable to fly. The mother bird was much perplexed when in due time her young ones could not fly, and went to consult a fairy about it. The fairy said, "Go and ask the stem of the tree near to which your nest is built, and it will tell you what to do. In return for this you must take the tree and fly away with it down to the ground." So the bird flew back to its nest, and addressing the tree, said, "Let my young ones fly, I pray thee." The man in the tree reft, "If I let them fly, will you carry me down to the ground in safety?" The eagle promised to do so, and the young man at once unfastened the cord she had tied round the wings of the young eagles, and they were immediately able to fly. Then the eagle took the tree, with the brother and sister in it, and flew with it down to the ground. On coming out from their late abode, these 2 survivors found themselves in great straits. They had no companions, no fire, and no receipt to eat. The brother, seeing a red bird not far from him, picked up a piece of old iron and struck at it. The bird flew away, and the iron struck a rock which gave forth a spark. Thus they discovered the way to get fire, and having gathered some dry stalks, they made a fire at which they warmed themselves. Finding no other human beings on the earth, the brother proposed to his sister that they should be man and wife. Here also the sister was unwilling, and here also the matter was to be decided by the 2 millstones as in the He Miao story, but in the Hua Miao version it was the brother who proposed that test. Here also the millstones were found in the valley one upon the other, but nothing is said about the way in which the brother deceived his sister. For a second trial the sister was to take a needle and the brother a piece of thread and throw them into the valley. If the needle was found threaded in the valley, it was agreed they should marry. The needle was found threaded in the valley, and so they became man and wife. When their child was born without arms and legs, they appealed to the fairy about it, who told them to cut up the child in 100 pieces, and throw the pieces in 100 different places. They did this, and next morning all these pieces had turned into men and women, who took their names from the things on which the pieces had fallen. Thus one was called water, another wood, another stone, and so on. Hence the 100 families, and this is how the earth was repeopled and how people got their names. The Guizhou Miao. 3 or 4 days south of Guiyang also tell the story of the flood. They also tell of a brother and sister, the only survivors, who were saved in a huge bottle gourd they had hollowed out for themselves. They also tell the story of the millstones, because the second test they mention 2 trees. If both bore fruit, they would marry; if one bore fruit and the other did not, they would not marry. Finally, they married and had 2 children, who were born mute and without arms or legs. These they cut in pieces, and the pieces turned into men and women. The Guizhou Miao say the man's name was Buai, and his sister's name Kue, like I in Sir. When talking Chinese they call Buai Fushi, who is sometimes called the Chinese Noah. Bu probably means ancestor, and I means one or first, and thus Buai almost certainly means first ancestor. In the name of the sister, Cumanian ancient, and E means water. The Miao, as we have mentioned, have no characters which would help to settle the meaning of a word. As in Chinese, they have many words pronounced exactly the same, but with very different meanings, so Chinese students, at all events, will understand why it is not wise to dogmatize about the meaning of Miao names. Besides, my Guizhou Miao vocabulary is very limited, but future students might bear these points in mind. The Guizhou Miao say that Panku divided heaven and earth. Panku in their own language they call Wakulo. Now the Chinese are by no means clear or unanimous as to the meaning of Panku. It is generally understood to be the name of a person, but some scholars suggest that the two words Panku mean ancient times beyond all question. The word ku as written means ancient * antiquity, and the word pan, among the many other things it means also * to coil, to wind, coiled, winding, thus Panku might mean revolving ages and be equivalent to long, long ago. In that case Pianku Kaitn, Piti would mean long, long ago heaven and earth were divided or formed. Wa Ku 40 is the Guizhou name or equivalent of Pianku. Wa means 10,000 and Lo means old. I am not sure what Ku means, but it is not unreasonable to suppose that it means the same here as in the name of the only woman survivor of the flood, Ku'e, and the same as in the Chinese name Panku. That is, that it is the Chinese word ku and means ancient, antiquity. This then would give us old 10,000 ages ago, as the Guizhou Miao equivalent of Panku. It should be noted that in the Miao language the adjectives come after nouns, and in adding the adjective lo, they would put it after waku. Wakue is evidently their rendering of the Chinese pianku, and lo is an addition of their own which personifies the term. Did they in former times say ages long ago? Heaven and earth were divided? And in course of time, as the tradition passed from generation to generation, and the meaning of it was partly lost, did they personify the term ages ago by adding the word ao to it, and thus say Wakulo, old Waku, divided heaven and earth? It seems very like it. In all the Miao stories of the flood, the three mentioned above and others, there are always just two survivors, a brother and sister, who became man and wife. It is interesting to note that Ovid in his story of the deluge knows only of two survivors, Deucalion and Pyrrha his wife, who was also his sister. This is manifest from the way Deucalion addresses her, *O sir, O coniacs, O femina sola supersts. They were told by an oracle to throw the bones off their great mother behind them. When they understood that by their great mother the earth was meant, and that by bones stones were meant, they threw stones behind them. Those thrown by the man became men, and those thrown by the woman became women, and thus in Ovid's story the earth was repeopled. If it should be objected that Deucalion and Pyrrha were only cousins, it is also possible that the two Miao survivors were also cousins. The children of brothers among the Miao and Chinese are reckoned as brothers and sisters, and not allowed to marry. We mentioned above that Buai, which almost certainly means first ancestor, is the Guizhou Miao name for Fuxi, who is sometimes called the Chinese Noah. Readers may thereby be led to infer that the Chinese also have a story of Noah's deluge, but this would be misleading. At the very dawn of Chinese history, in the days of Yao and Xuan, 2200 B.C., the Book of History mentions a terrible inundation which desolated the land. This must have been caused at that time by an abnormal rise of the Yellow River, and probably also by the giving way of its embankments. Subsequently this water, which covered much of the land for many years, was drawn off by the unwearied labors of Yi, who later became king and founder of the Xia dynasty. It was after 9 years' hard work, clearing out the old and cutting new channels for the water, that the land was drained. There can be no doubt that Yao, Xuan, and Yi were historical characters, but much of what is said of them in the historical books is legendary. They were the earliest leaders of the Chinese people, and later times regarded them as ideal kings, endowing them with all virtue, all wisdom, and with superhuman ability. It is not difficult in those legends of the overflow of the Yellow River to trace the legend of an earlier and more terrible flood. It is said, in their vast extent the waters, embrace the mountains and overtop the hills, threatening heaven with their floods. This is very extraordinary language to use in describing an abnormal rise of the Yellow River. Dr. Legge, in his Prolegomena to the Shu King or Book of History, touches on this question and concludes by saying, I think, therefore, that in the description of the inundation of Yao's time we have an imperfect reference to the deluge of Noah. Why Fuxi is sometimes called the Chinese Noah is not very clear. According to Chinese mythology, Pan Ku was the first man, but Fuxi was also the first man of another epoch, and it is worthy of note that there were 10 generations between Pan Ku and Fuxi. The time of Fuxi is given as 2852 BC. Evidently for these reasons some writers have spoken of Fuxi as the Chinese Noah. This opinion is confirmed by the Guizhou Miao legend of Buai, who was beyond all doubt their Noah, and whom when speaking Chinese they call Fuxi.